February 18, 1943. Boeing Field, Seattle, Washington. The pencil trembled slightly in Diplomacy. Werner Bomback's hand as he reviewed intelligence photographs spread across the mahogany desk at Luftwaffe High Command headquarters in Berlin. The grainy reconnaissance images showed something that contradicted 3 years of German technical superiority. An American bomber so large, so ungainly, so impossibly complex that it appeared to be a propaganda fabrication. Through the lens of German engineering excellence, this Boeing creation looked like nothing more than an oversized toy. A desperate American attempt to match German aviation prowess through brute force rather than refined design. Bomback, a decorated Luftwaffe bomber pilot and Knight's Cross recipient, studied the specifications his intelligence officers had compiled. A 4-engine bomber weighing over 60,000 pounds empty, powered by experimental 18-cylinder radial engines producing 2,000 horsepower each, equipped with a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets operated by analog computers, and a claimed range exceeding 3,000 miles. The numbers seemed fantastical, the product of American industrial optimism disconnected from aeronautical reality. Die Amerikaner bauen Spielzeug, he muttered to his adjutant. The Americans build toys. His laughter echoed through the oak-paneled room as he circled a particular notation with red ink. Maximum bomb load, 20,000 pounds. Service ceiling, 31,850 feet. They promise miracles, he said, sliding the folder across his desk. Let us see if their flying warehouse can even reach altitude before the engines fail. What Bomback didn't know, what none of the German engineers analyzing these early intelligence reports could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would render their entire strategic philosophy obsolete. Within 30 months, these American toys would be incinerating Japanese cities from altitudes German fighters couldn't reach, dropping bombs with precision German engineers thought impossible, and carrying weapons that would literally split atoms. The transformation from objects of mockery to instruments of apocalypse would happen so swiftly, so completely, that by war's end, the Soviets would be desperately reverse-engineering crashed examples, and the entire concept of strategic air power would be redefined around this single aircraft's capabilities. The mathematics of devastation were already being calculated in American factories, even as German intelligence officers laughed. For main assembly plants spanning from Washington state to Georgia, thousands of subcontractors producing 40,540 individual parts per aircraft. Production schedules calling for 3,970 bombers at a total cost of $3.7 billion, exceeding even the Manhattan Project's $1.9 billion budget. Each aircraft requiring 12 tons of aluminum sheeting, over 1,000 pounds of copper, 600,000 rivets, 9 miles of wiring, and 2 miles of tubing for its construction. The largest single military expenditure in human history. A gamble so massive that failure would have bankrupted American military aviation. Yet on that February morning in 1943, as Bomback filed his dismissive report, the second XB-29 prototype was preparing for a routine test flight from Boeing Field. Test pilot Edmund T. Eddie Allen, Boeing's chief test pilot with over 10,000 flight hours, was conducting a 2-hour power plant performance evaluation. At 12:17 p.m., leaking fuel from a filler cap and the wing leading edge ran down inside the structure and ignited. The port wing spar burned through and collapsed, sending the enormous bomber crashing into the fry meat packing plant 3 miles from Boeing Field. All 11 men aboard the aircraft and 18 workers in the plant were killed instantly. The disaster sent shockwaves through Boeing's engineering staff. Oliver West, the production engineer who had designed the revolutionary multi-lining assembly process to handle the B-29's complexity, stared at the smoking wreckage and understood the magnitude of what they had undertaken. The Boeing company declared publicly that it was not going to build this airplane. It's no good. It has too many problems. General Henry Hap Arnold, chief of the Army Air Forces and the spiritual father of the B-29 program, responded with characteristic bluntness. He argued with Boeing executives and threatened to force them to repay the $200 million already allocated. Faced with financial ruin, Boeing agreed to operate the factories, but clarified they would not take any responsibility for the airplane. This capitulation, born of economic necessity rather than engineering confidence, would produce the most complex aircraft ever attempted. The design origins traced back to June 1940, when Arnold had initiated development of what he called a super bomber. The specifications seemed impossible even by American standards of industrial optimism. A bomber capable of delivering 20,000 pounds of ordnance to a target 2,667 miles distant, at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, from altitudes where the air was too thin for conventional aircraft to operate effectively. Boeing's response, designated Model 345, featured innovations so radical that conservative military planners questioned whether they were chasing fantasy rather than functional capability. Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, who had created the P-47 Thunderbolt, examined captured intelligence on the B-29 in late 1943 and wrote to a colleague at Wright Field, "The Americans have violated every principle of weight-efficient design. This aircraft is a dinosaur." But, he added after reviewing the technical specifications more carefully, "It is a dinosaur with perfect proportions. If their engines work, if their systems function, if their production capability matches their ambition, they will have created something unprecedented." The engines were the first miracle required. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower, was the most powerful aviation engine ever mass-produced. Its double-stack cylinder configuration, with 2 rows of 9 cylinders each, generated unprecedented power density. It also generated catastrophic heat. Engine temperatures regularly exceeded 300 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause thermal expansion beyond design tolerances. The crankcase, constructed of magnesium to save weight, was light and strong, but magnesium burns with unstoppable intensity once ignited. Engine fires became so common during early operations that crews nicknamed the B-29 3 turning and 1 burning. Major James Patillo, a former B-17 instructor pilot, selected for early B-29 training, described his first encounter with the aircraft in October 1943. The engine was a disaster the first year in combat. Overheating, fires, complete failures on takeoff. We lost more aircraft to mechanical failure than enemy action. But as the R-3350 became more reliable, noticeable by May-June 1945, the B-29 proved to be the world's best heavy bomber of World War II. That transformation, from death trap to war winner, required solving problems that German engineers insisted were insurmountable. The pressurization system represented the second engineering miracle. The B-29 featured 3 separate pressurized crew compartments, one in the nose for the bombardier, pilot, flight engineer, navigator, and radio operator, a second aft of the wing for the gunners, and an isolated compartment for the tail gunner. A pressurized tunnel 30 feet long connected the forward and aft stations, allowing crew movement while maintaining seal integrity. The system maintained cabin pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet altitude, while the aircraft flew at 30,000 feet, where outside temperatures reached -40 degrees Fahrenheit and oxygen was insufficient to support human consciousness. German intelligence officers studying captured technical manuals in 1944 were particularly skeptical of this feature. Oberingenieur Friedrich von Rohr, head of Luftwaffe Technical Intelligence, wrote in a classified assessment, "The American claims of fully pressurized compartments capable of maintaining seal integrity under combat damage are technically impossible. Any penetration of the fuselage skin will cause catastrophic decompression, rendering the crew incapacitated. This design demonstrates American lack of understanding of basic aeronautical engineering principles under combat conditions." What von Rohr failed to understand was that American engineers had anticipated exactly this problem and solved it through redundancy and sectional design. The 3 separate compartments could be individually sealed. A hit in one section would not depressurize the entire aircraft. Moreover, the General Electric Central Fire Control System eliminated the need for gunners to occupy exposed turret positions, keeping them safely inside pressurized compartments while operating weapons remotely. This fire control system constituted the third miracle, and the one that German engineers found most impossible to believe. 5 interconnected sighting stations located in the nose, tail, and 3 plexiglass blisters in the central fuselage controlled 4 remotely operated turrets, each armed with 2.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. 5 separate General Electric analog computers, one dedicated to each sighting station, calculated ballistic corrections for airspeed, lead, gravity, temperature, and humidity. A gunner would focus targeting dots from his gun sight onto an enemy aircraft and track it briefly. The computer would calculate range and speed, then automatically adjust aim to account for the fact that a bomber flying at 250 miles per hour at 30,000 feet would curve a bullet's trajectory approximately 36 feet. The system also compensated for gravity drop of nearly 14 feet at 800 yards range and calculated proper lead for enemy fighters closing at 400 miles per hour. The complexity defied German understanding of practical combat systems. Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring ace, with 352 victories, examined captured gun camera footage showing a B-29's defensive fire in December 1944. "The American gunner is not aiming where the target is," he observed to his squadron intelligence officer. "The computer is leading the target automatically. This removes human error from deflection shooting. If this system functions reliably, intercepting these bombers becomes a mathematical problem, not a combat engagement. The bomber that can calculate faster than the pilot can maneuver will always win." The first XB-29 prototype made its maiden flight from Boeing Field on September 21, 1942, before an audience of nearly all Boeing employees who had contributed 1,300,000 man-hours to the project. Test pilot Eddie Allen reported that the aircraft handled like a fighter when light, like a truck when loaded. The massive 141-foot wingspan, with its high aspect ratio design, generated exceptional lift, but also created tremendous structural loads. Boeing engineers had designed the wing spars to support 40,000 pounds, 3 times the aircraft's maximum loaded weight, anticipating combat damage and hard maneuvering that would stress the airframe beyond normal flight parameters. By the time the first YB-29 service test aircraft made its initial flight on June 26, 1943, there were already 1,664 Superfortresses on order. The scale of commitment before proving operational viability shocked military observers. Lieutenant Colonel Curtis LeMay, a rising star in the 8th Air Force, who would later command all B-29 operations against Japan, wrote to Arnold's staff, "We are gambling the entire strategic bombing concept on an aircraft that hasn't completed testing. If this fails, if these bombers cannot perform as promised, we will have wasted resources that could have built 10,000 proven B-17s or B-24s." The gamble required industrial mobilization unprecedented in aviation history. 4 main assembly plants were constructed specifically for B-29 production. Boeing's Wichita, Kansas facility, built on empty prairie land, covered 3,644,000 square feet and employed 29,795 workers at peak production. The Bell Aircraft plant in Marietta, Georgia, sprawled across 3,960,000 square feet, making it the largest building in the American South. The Martin plant in Bellevue, Nebraska, at what is now Offutt Air Force Base, and Boeing's Renton, Washington facility completed the production network. Together, these factories would produce 3,970 B-29s between 1943 and 1946, with thousands of subcontractors providing components from 32 states. The production challenge exceeded anything attempted in aviation. Each B-29 required 12 tons of aluminum sheeting at a time, when aluminum was the most strategically critical material in the war economy. The electrical system alone consumed 9 miles of wiring per aircraft, demanding copper resources that competed with ammunition production. The manufacturing complexity initially required 157,000 man-hours per aircraft for the first 100 bombers built. Through revolutionary assembly techniques developed by Oliver West, including the multi-lining system that replaced traditional single assembly lines with 6 parallel lines, converging at 3 final assembly points, production time dropped to 78,000 hours for the second 100, then 57,000 for the third 100. By 1944, Skilled workers were completing B-29s in just 30,000 man-hours, a reduction of over 80% through experience and process refinement. The human cost of this learning curve was substantial. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding the 56 Fighter Group and one of America's top aces, was temporarily assigned to oversee B-29 crew training at Bridgeport, Connecticut in late 1942. His unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents between September 1942 and January 1943. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would in the first months of combat, Zemke wrote in his mission diary. The B-29 was worse. It ground-looped on landing from the heavy tail weight. It torque-rolled on takeoff from engine power. It dove with such enthusiasm that pilots discovered compressibility effects, the controls freezing as shock waves formed on the wings approaching transonic speeds. This aircraft was teaching us aerodynamics through fatal accidents. German intelligence received reports of these training disasters with satisfaction. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, commander of Luftwaffe fighter forces, wrote in a January 1944 assessment, "American losses in training their crews for this experimental bomber exceed combat losses we inflict on their proven B-17 formations." This confirms our analysis that the B-29 represents American industrial excess, attempting to compensate for lack of aeronautical sophistication. Should these aircraft be deployed to Europe, our fighter forces will find them easier targets than the already vulnerable fortress formations. What Galland didn't know was that the B-29 would never be deployed to Europe. Arnold, working directly with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, had designated the Superfortress exclusively for the Pacific theater from the earliest planning stages. The distances in the Pacific dwarfed European operations. From England to Berlin measured 600 miles. From potential Pacific bases to Tokyo exceeded 1,500 miles. The B-29's extraordinary range, purchased through its size, complexity, and cost, made it the only aircraft capable of reaching Japan's home islands until island bases could be captured closer to the enemy heartland. The strategic concept was designated Operation Matterhorn, and it represented logistical ambition bordering on madness. B-29s would be based in India, near Calcutta, and staged through forward bases near Chengdu in inland China to attack targets in Japan, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part for the Chinese bases had to be flown over the hump. The Himalayan air route that was itself one of the most dangerous flight paths in the world. The economics were brutal. It required 12 B-29 ferry flights between India and China to stockpile enough fuel for one bomber to fly a single combat mission to Japan and return. Brigadier General Kenneth Wolfe, commanding the XX Bomber Command assigned to Matterhorn, arrived in India in March 1944 with 160 B-29s. By April, his units were flying transport missions from Calcutta to Chengdu, essentially using strategic bombers as cargo aircraft. The absurdity of employing the world's most expensive and complex aircraft for logistic support was not lost on subordinate commanders. Colonel William H. Blanchard, commanding the 40th Bombardment Group, wrote in his personal journal, "We are using million-dollar bombers to haul gasoline across mountains. Each sortie costs more than small countries spend on defense annually. This is either the most sophisticated logistics operation in history or the most wasteful boondoggle ever conceived." The first B-29 combat mission launched on June 5, 1944, against railroad targets in Bangkok, Thailand. Of 98 B-29s that attempted takeoff, one crashed immediately, killed its entire crew. 5 more were lost to mechanical failures en route or during return. 0 enemy aircraft were destroyed. The mission demonstrated that the Superfortress could reach distant targets, but raised serious questions about reliability and effectiveness. 10 days later, on June 15th to 16th, 1944, came the mission that German and Japanese intelligence had anticipated with mixture of dread and skepticism, the first B-29 strike on the Japanese home islands. 75 superfortresses departed Chinese bases to attack the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yaoda in northern Kyushu. Only 47 aircraft actually bombed the primary target. Little damage was caused. 5 B-29s were lost to accidents. 2 were destroyed by Japanese fighters. But the psychological impact was profound. For the first time since the Doolittle raid of April 1942, American bombers had struck Japan. The sacred home islands were no longer invulnerable. Japanese Air Self-Defense Force records captured after the war revealed the impact on military planning. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had warned before Pearl Harbor that Japan would run wild for 6 months before American industrial might crush them, had been proven prophetic. Japanese officers studying wreckage of the first B-29 shot down over Kyushu filed reports that mirrored German skepticism. The aircraft is crudely constructed compared to our fighters, wrote Commander Minoru Genda, Air Operations Officer for the combined fleet. Excessive weight, primitive systems, wasteful design. However, the scale of production suggested by intelligence estimates indicates the Americans can afford crude effectiveness. 10,000 crude bombers will defeat 1,000 perfect fighters through sheer numerical advantage. What Genda failed to grasp was that the B-29 was far from crude. Its apparent simplicity concealed sophisticated engineering, focused on maintainability and production efficiency rather than elegant minimalism. German and Japanese aircraft featured beautifully machined components, hand-fitted assemblies, artisanal construction that produced technically excellent individual aircraft at low production rates. American engineers had designed for mass production from the beginning. Interchangeable parts, modular systems, redundant components that could be swapped in field conditions by mechanics with minimal training. The B-29 was crude in the same way a factory was crude compared to a craftsman's workshop, crude in scale and purpose, not in capability. By November 1944, the strategic situation had transformed completely. American forces had captured the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam after brutal fighting that cost over 20,000 American casualties. But these islands, 1,500 miles from Tokyo, provided airfield locations that rendered the logistically nightmarish China-Burma-India operations obsolete. XXI Bomber Command, under Brigadier General Haywood Hansel, began operations from the Marianas on November 24, 1944, with Operation San Antonio I against the Musashino aircraft plant near Tokyo. The mission revealed new problems. Of 111 B-29s dispatched, only 24 struck the primary target. The others bombed port facilities and urban areas through clouds. The issue was not enemy defenses. Only one B-29 was shot down despite interception by 125 Japanese fighters. The problem was weather, specifically winds. American meteorologists had discovered the jet stream, winds at 23,000 to 30,000 feet that reached 250 miles per hour, stronger than the B-29's cruising speed. Bombs released into these winds scattered harmlessly across the countryside. High-altitude precision bombing, the doctrine that had guided American strategic theory since the 1930s, was physically impossible over Japan. Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of XXI Bomber Command in January 1945, replacing Hansel. Arnold made clear that failure was not acceptable. "If you don't get results," Arnold's aide warned LeMay, "you'll be fired." LeMay, who had earned the nickname Iron Ass for his relentless focus on mission accomplishment, studied the problem with engineers' pragmatism. High-altitude bombing didn't work because of weather and winds. Japanese industry wasn't concentrated in massive factories like Germany's, but distributed across thousands of small workshops integrated into residential areas. Incendiary attacks on Japanese cities, built primarily of wood and paper, would be far more effective than high-explosive bombs against concrete German structures. On March 9 to 10, 1945, LeMay implemented the most radical tactical shift in strategic bombing history. Operation Meeting House sent 334 B-29s against Tokyo at night, at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, carrying nothing but incendiary bombs. LeMay stripped defensive armament except tail guns, reducing weight and allowing each bomber to carry 7 tons of M26 incendiary clusters. The attack pattern involved Pathfinder aircraft marking a large X in Tokyo's densely populated Shitamachi district, followed by successive waves dropping incendiaries to create a firestorm. The results exceeded even LeMay's expectations. Approximately 1,665 tons of incendiaries ignited fires that merged into a conflagration covering 15.8 square miles. Temperatures at ground level reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to boil water in canals and liquefy asphalt in streets. An estimated 100,000 people died, more than either atomic bomb would kill. The firestorm was visible to B-29 crews 150 miles away. Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant Robert F. Raymer, flying in Superfortress, the Great Artiste, described the scene in his mission report. The city was an ocean of fire. We could smell burning flesh inside the aircraft through our oxygen masks. Updrafts from the heat lifted our bomber 5,000 feet in seconds. I watched people running through streets that were rivers of fire. This was not bombing. This was apocalypse. German observers monitoring American strategic bombing through intelligence channels received reports of Tokyo's destruction with disbelief, transitioning to horror. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, read the assessment prepared by his intelligence staff and reportedly told his adjutant, "This is propaganda. No bomber force can destroy 16 square miles of a city in a single night. The British required hundreds of raids to achieve similar destruction of our cities." His staff produced aerial reconnaissance photographs obtained through neutral diplomatic channels. Göring studied the images in silence, then asked, "How many bombers?" When told the figure was 334, he performed quick calculations. Each bomber carried approximately 5 tons of incendiaries, over 1,600 tons total, and they flew how far? 1,500 miles each way. He closed the file. If the Americans can deliver this tonnage at these distances routinely, and if similar capabilities are deployed against Germany, no city is defensible. This changes everything about strategic bombing doctrine. What changed most was the systematic nature of destruction. Operation Meeting House was followed by similar raids against Nagoya on March 11th to 12th, Osaka on March 13th to 14th, Kobe on March 16th to 17th, and Nagoya again on March 18th to 19th. In 10 days, XXI Bomber Command struck 5 of Japan's largest cities, killed an estimated 250,000 people, destroyed approximately 31 square miles of urban area, and rendered over 1.2 million homeless. The attacks only paused because XXI Bomber Command exhausted its stockpiles of incendiary munitions. By August 1945, American B-29s had struck 66 Japanese cities, destroyed 178 square miles of urban area, killed approximately 330,000 people, injured nearly 500,000 more, and left 8.5 million homeless. Japanese defenses proved inadequate against the Superfortress onslaught. The Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan's legendary fighter, could reach the altitudes where B-29s operated, but barely. At 30,000 feet, the Zero's performance degraded significantly, its climb rate reduced to a crawl, its maneuverability compromised by thin air. The Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo and Kawanishi N1K George were designed specifically as high-altitude interceptors, but arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the campaign. Japanese pilots resorted to desperate tactics, including ramming attacks where fighters deliberately crashed into B-29s, sacrificing pilot and aircraft to destroy a single bomber. Lieutenant Ryoji Ohara, a fighter pilot with the 47th Air Regiment, survived 3 ramming attempts against B-29s and described the tactical impossible situation in post-war interviews. The American bombers operated at altitudes where our engines struggled. When we reached them, we found aircraft more heavily armed than any we had encountered. Their gun turrets tracked us with computer precision. Approaching from any angle except directly behind exposed us to defensive fire from multiple turrets simultaneously. Even successful attacks rarely brought them down. We would empty our ammunition into a Superfortress, see hits, see fires, and watch the bomber continue formation flying as if nothing had happened. They had redundant systems, armor components, engines that ran despite damage. Our aircraft, built light for maneuverability, were destroyed by single hits. Theirs absorbed dozens and continued fighting, The climax of the B-29's evolution came on August 6th and 9th, 1945, when specially modified silver plate B-29s delivered atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, commanding the 509th Composite Group, had personally selected B-29 serial number 44 to 86,292 from the Martin Omaha production line on May 9, 1945. He named the aircraft Enola Gay after his mother. The silver plate modifications included removal of all gun turrets except the tail position, installation of modified bomb bay with pneumatic doors and British bomb attachment systems, upgraded engines with fuel injection, and deletion of armor plate to reduce weight and increase performance. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6th, Tibbets and his crew of 11 lifted off from Northfield, Tinian, carrying a uranium-235 gun-type fission weapon-designated Little Boy. The bomb weighed 9,700 pounds and contained 64 kilograms of enriched uranium. At 8:15 a.m. local time, Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee released the weapon from 31,000 feet over Hiroshima. The bomb fell for 43 seconds before detonating at approximately 1,900 feet altitude. The explosion yielded 15 kilotons, equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The fireball reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit at ground zero. Approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people died instantly, with total casualties eventually exceeding 135,000. The city's buildings within 1.6 miles of the detonation point were destroyed completely. 3 days later, Major Charles Sweeney flew B-29 number 44 to 27,297, named Boxcar, on the second atomic mission. Carrying a plutonium-239 implosion-type weapon-designated Fat Man, Sweeney encountered weather problems over the primary target of Kokura and diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The 10,213-pound weapon detonated at 11:02 a.m. local time at approximately 1,650 feet altitude, yielding 21 kilotons. The city's hilly terrain limited blast effects compared to Hiroshima's flat geography, but casualties still ranged from 39,000 to 80,000 killed. The strategic impact transcended the immediate destruction. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, citing in part a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. The B-29 had delivered weapons that literally split atoms and helped force the unconditional surrender of two major powers without the need for invasion. Werner Bombeck, the German bomber pilot who had laughed at early intelligence photos of the XB-29, did not survive to see the complete vindication of American engineering. He died in a crash while testing a captured German jet fighter in Argentina in 1953. His final assessment of the B-29, written in a memoir published posthumously, acknowledged the transformation of his understanding. We judge the American bomber by standards of weight efficiency and aerodynamic elegance. We failed to understand that Americans were solving a different problem than we faced. They needed to reach targets 3,000 miles distant, operate above 30,000 feet per hour, carry bomb loads exceeding anything we contemplated, and return crews safely despite battle damage. They achieved this through brute force engineering, accepting weight penalties we would never tolerate, incorporating redundancies we considered wasteful, and designing for mass production rather than artisanal perfection. The result was crude by our aesthetic standards, but devastatingly effective by operational measures. We built beautiful aircraft that lost the war. They built practical aircraft that won it. The B-29 taught us that in total war, practical effectiveness matters infinitely more than technical elegance. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the B-29 story was the compressed timeline of its development and deployment. From Arnold's initial specification in June 1940 to the first prototype flight in September 1942 took just 27 months. From that first flight to combat operations over Bangkok in June 1944 was another 21 months. From combat debut to delivering atomic weapons that ended the war required just 14 months. In under 5 years, American engineers, workers, and crews had taken a concept that seemed impossible, transformed it into the most complex aircraft ever built, produced nearly 4,000 examples, deployed them across the Pacific, and used them to achieve strategic victory. This accomplishment represented industrial capability and organizational efficiency on a scale that no other nation could match. The human cost of this achievement deserves acknowledgement. Beyond the 414 B-29s lost in combat and the thousands of crew members killed, the development and production program itself extracted significant sacrifice. The Eddy Allen crash of February 1943 killed 29 people. Training accidents throughout 1943 and early 1944 killed hundreds of crew members before they ever reached combat. Factory accidents at the 4 main production plants killed 78 workers and injured thousands more during the brutal production schedules. The aluminum required for B-29 production came from plants powered by hydroelectric dams built specifically for war production, displacing thousands of families and fundamentally altering the geography of the American West. The copper for electrical systems came from mines, where workers labored under wartime production pressures that often prioritized output over safety. For the Japanese people, the B-29 became synonymous with apocalyptic destruction. The firebombing campaign killed approximately 330,000 civilians and left 8.5 million homeless. The atomic bombings killed another 200,000 to 250,000 people, with many dying years later from radiation-related illnesses. Japanese survivors of the bombing campaigns, known as hibakusha for atomic bomb survivors, carried both physical and psychological scars for the remainder of their lives. The ethical questions raised by strategic bombing, particularly area bombing of civilian populations, would be debated for generations. The B-29 was the instrument of this destruction, though the decisions about how to employ it were made by political and military leadership balancing competing moral considerations against imperatives to end the war and minimize casualties among their own forces. The strategic bombing survey conducted by American analysts after the war attempted to quantify the B-29's impact on Japanese war-making capability. The findings were sobering. By August 1945, Japanese aircraft production had fallen to 50 aircraft per month from a peak of 2,572 per month in September 1944. Oil refining capacity was reduced to 15% of peak levels. Transportation infrastructure was so disrupted that raw materials couldn't reach factories and finished goods couldn't reach military units. The Japanese merchant fleet, which had totaled 6,384,000 tons in December 1941, was reduced to 312,000 tons by August 1945, largely due to B-29 laid mines and submarine attacks coordinated with aerial reconnaissance. These effects, combined with naval blockade and conventional military operations, had brought Japanese industry to functional collapse even before atomic weapons were employed. What remains most striking about the B-29 story is how completely it validated American strategic bombing theory while simultaneously forcing its evolution. Pre-war doctrine, developed at the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s, had emphasized precision daylight bombing of industrial targets using heavily armed bombers flying in defensive formations. The B-29 was designed specifically to execute this doctrine. However, operational realities over Japan, particularly the jet stream and weather conditions, rendered precision bombing impractical. LeMay's shift to low-altitude nighttime incendiary attacks represented complete abandonment of the original doctrine. Yet this flexibility, this willingness to discard theory when reality demanded different approaches, itself represented a characteristically American pragmatism. The goal was not to validate doctrine but to win wars. When doctrine proved inadequate, American commanders adapted immediately. The contrast with Axis powers' doctrinal rigidity was stark. German strategic bombing theory, derived from De Hett's theories and refined through Spanish Civil War experience, emphasized tactical support of ground forces rather than independent strategic campaigns. The Luftwaffe never developed a true heavy bomber, focusing instead on medium bombers like the Heinkel E-111 and Junkers Ju-88 designed to support Wehrmacht operations. When strategic bombing of Britain began in 1940, German forces lacked both the aircraft and the operational doctrine to conduct sustained campaigns against industrial targets. Japanese strategic bombing doctrine was even more limited, with naval aviation focused on ship attack and army aviation on ground support. Neither Axis power developed anything approaching the B-29's capability, because neither conceived of warfare at the industrial scale that strategic bombing represented. The Soviet Union, despite reverse engineering the B-29 as the II-4, never fully embraced American-style strategic bombing doctrine. Soviet military theory emphasized combined arms operations, with aviation providing tactical support to ground forces. The II-4 served primarily as a nuclear delivery system, a role requiring only small numbers of aircraft rather than the massed formations American doctrine employed. This reflected different strategic priorities and resource allocations. The Soviet Union, having suffered devastating ground invasion, invested heavily in armor, artillery, and tactical aviation. The United States, protected by oceans from ground invasion, developed strategic bombing as its preferred method of projecting power against distant adversaries. By the 1950s, jet technology and nuclear weapons had transformed strategic bombing beyond recognition. The B-47 Stratojet, entering service in 1951, could fly at 600 miles per hour at 40,000 feet, delivering nuclear weapons with precision impossible for conventional bombers. The B-52 Superfortress, first flown in 1952, combined intercontinental range with jet speed and high-altitude capability, making it the ultimate expression of strategic bombing theory. Both aircraft owed intellectual debts to the B-29, but represented quantum leaps in capability that made the Superfortress obsolete for its original mission. The B-29 had proven the concept. Jet bombers refined it into Cold War doctrine. Yet in one crucial aspect, the B-29 remained unsurpassed. It was the only aircraft ever to deliver atomic weapons in combat. This distinction, achieved on 2 August days in 1945, defined the aircraft's historical significance more than any other achievement. The firebombing campaigns destroyed more total area and killed more people, but the atomic missions represented a fundamental break in human history. Warfare had entered the nuclear age, and the B-29 was the vehicle of that transition. Every nuclear-capable bomber developed subsequently, from the B-50 through the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, existed in the shadow of what Enola Gay and Boxcar had done over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The men who flew the B-29 in combat developed profound respect for the aircraft, despite its early mechanical problems and operational challenges. Technical Sergeant Henry Irwin, a radio operator with the 52nd Bombardment Squadron, received the Medal of Honor for heroic actions aboard a B-29 during an April 1945 mission over Koriyama, Japan. A phosphorus smoke bomb ignited prematurely in the aircraft, filling the fuselage with burning white phosphorus at 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. Irwin, despite suffering severe burns over much of his body, picked up the burning bomb and crawled forward to the cockpit, where he threw it out the co-pilot's window, saving the aircraft and crew. He survived his injuries after 41 surgeries and lived until 2002, a testament both to his courage and to advances in burn treatment pioneered treating B-29 crew members injured in similar accidents. Such incidents were more common than post-war histories often acknowledge. The incendiary weapons the B-29 carried were inherently dangerous. The M26 incendiary bomb clusters, each containing 47 individual bomblets filled with napalm, occasionally ignited prematurely in bomb bays during turbulence or flak damage. Phosphorus smoke markers used by Pathfinder aircraft could ignite if improperly handled. The magnesium components in the R-3350 engines burned with such intensity that engine fires often consumed entire nacelles before crews could activate fire suppression systems. Flying the B-29 in combat required not just piloting skill, but constant vigilance against mechanical failures that could prove as lethal as enemy action. The enemy action itself was substantial, despite the B-29's defensive capabilities. Japanese fighters developed tactics specifically to counter the Superfortress formations. The most effective approach involved high-speed diving attacks from 12 o'clock high, the one angle where the B-29's fire control system had limited coverage due to the forward fuselage blocking turret fields of fire. Pilots would dive from 35,000 feet, build speed to over 400 miles per hour, fire a quick burst at the bomber's cockpit area, then use momentum to zoom climb back to altitude before defensive guns could track effectively. This tactic required exceptional piloting skill and courage, as the closing rate left only seconds for accurate fire. Many Japanese pilots died attempting it, but those who mastered the technique were responsible for most B-29 shoot-downs attributed to fighter action. Japanese anti-aircraft artillery proved less effective than German flak had been over Europe, primarily due to altitude limitations. The standard Japanese 75mm and 88mm anti-aircraft guns had maximum effective altitude ranges of approximately 25,000 feet. B-29s cruising at 30,000 feet were largely immune to these weapons. Later in the war, Japanese forces deployed 120mm guns capable of reaching 35,000 feet, but in limited numbers and without the radar fire control systems that made German flak so deadly. Consequently, anti-aircraft fire accounted for only 64 B-29 losses, less than 16% of total combat losses. The true threat to B-29 operations was mechanical reliability, particularly in the first year of combat. The R-3350 engine's problems persisted well into 1945. Lieutenant Robert Copeland, a B-29 pilot with the 870th Bombardment Squadron, logged 35 combat missions and experienced engine failures on 12 of them. We would be cruising at 30,000 feet over the Pacific, 1,000 miles from base, and suddenly one engine would start running rough, he recalled in a 1990 interview. The flight engineer would try to stabilize it, adjusting mixture and throttle, but often it would catch fire. Standard procedure was to feather the prop, activate fire suppression, and continue on 3 engines. The B-29 could fly on 2 engines if necessary, though not at altitude and not fully loaded. We would dump bombs if we had to, sacrifice the mission to save the aircraft and crew. On 3 occasions, I returned to base on 2 engines, flying at 8,000 feet, watching the water and praying we'd make it. The Superfortress saved our lives through sheer structural strength and redundant systems. A lesser aircraft would have killed us a dozen times over. These experiences shaped the veteran B-29 crew's fierce loyalty to their aircraft despite its flaws. The Superfortress community developed a culture similar to the B-17 and B-24 crews in Europe, with aircraft receiving names, nose art, and individual identities. Crews personalized their bombers extensively, adding custom equipment, comfort modifications, and lucky charms. The practice of naming aircraft after female relatives, girlfriends, or wives was near universal. Enola Gay was named for Paul Tibbet's mother. The Great Artiste, which flew on both atomic missions as an observation aircraft, was named by its commander, Captain Kermit Behan. Boxcar was named after its usual commander, Captain Frederick Bach, though Charles Sweeney flew it on the Nagasaki mission. These names humanized 67-ton war machines and provided psychological connection between crews and aircraft. The ground crews who maintained B-29s worked under conditions as challenging as those faced by air crews. The tropical climate of Pacific Island bases caused constant maintenance problems. Humidity corroded electrical systems. Salt air degraded aluminum skin. Coral dust from airstrips infiltrated engines and control surfaces. The R-3350 engines required complete overhaul after just 750 hours of operation, 1/3 the service life of contemporary radial engines. Each overhaul required 300 man-hours of skilled labor by trained mechanics. With 3,970 B-29s in service, each with 4 engines requiring regular overhaul, the maintenance burden exceeded anything previously attempted in aviation. The fact that XXI Bomber Command maintained operational readiness rates averaging 60%, meaning 60% of assigned aircraft were mission-capable at any given time, testified to extraordinary maintenance proficiency under primitive conditions. The logistics supporting B-29 operations in the Pacific represented industrial achievement comparable to the aircraft itself. Each combat mission required approximately 7,000 gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel per bomber, 28,000 gallons for a 4-aircraft flight, 336,000 gallons for a typical 48-aircraft group mission. This fuel had to be transported by tanker ships from California refineries to Pacific Island bases, offloaded through makeshift port facilities, stored in fuel farms constructed on captured enemy territory, and distributed to hardstands where aircraft were parked. The bombs, ranging from 500-pound general-purpose bombs to 2,000-pound armor-piercing bombs to M26 incendiary clusters, were shipped separately, assembled on-site, and loaded using hydraulic bomb hoists specifically designed for the B-29's cavernous bomb bays. Spare parts for 40,540 different components per aircraft had to be stocked at forward bases, prioritized by failure rates analyzed by statisticians working for Air Materiel Command. This logistics system was itself an innovation born of necessity. The Army Air Forces developed the first computerized inventory management system to track B-29 spare parts. Using IBM punch card tabulating machines, logistics officers could query parts availability across the entire Pacific theater in hours rather than weeks. This primitive data processing system, a precursor to modern computer logistics networks, enabled the maintenance of complex aircraft thousands of miles from manufacturing centers. Without it, B-29 operations would have collapsed under the weight of their own logistical requirements. The strategic effects of B-29 operations extended beyond physical destruction of Japanese cities and industry. The psychological impact on Japanese civilian population and military leadership was profound and multifaceted. For civilians, the bombing campaigns demonstrated the government's inability to protect the home islands despite years of propaganda promising invincibility. This erosion of faith in official pronouncements contributed to acceptance of surrender when it finally came. For military leaders, the B-29 represented an unwinnable mathematical problem. Japan's industrial capacity was insufficient to produce enough fighters, anti-aircraft guns, or ammunition to defend against raids of 300 to 500 bombers attacking with increasing frequency. The resource dilemma was acute. Defending against B-29s required diverting aircraft, fuel, and ammunition from other fronts, but failing to defend meant accelerating destruction of cities and factories needed to sustain the war. Emperor Hirohito's August 15, 1945 radio broadcast announcing surrender specifically mentioned the atomic bombs, but referenced the broader air campaign's devastation. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives, he stated. But he also noted that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. This broader reference encompassed the systematic destruction of Japanese cities by conventional B-29 raids, the naval blockade that was starving the home islands, and the complete collapse of Japan's strategic position. The atomic bombs provided a face-saving explanation for surrender, but the B-29's conventional campaign had already made continuation of the war materially impossible. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese historians has explored whether Japan would have surrendered without atomic weapons or invasion. The consensus suggests surrender was inevitable by late 1945 due to cumulative effects of strategic bombing, naval blockade, and Soviet entry into the war. The atomic bombs accelerated the timeline and provided the shock necessary to overcome Japanese military leadership's resistance to surrender terms. The B-29, in both its conventional and atomic roles, was the instrument that made this outcome possible. Without an aircraft capable of reaching Japan from distant bases with meaningful bomb loads, American strategy would have required either accepting huge casualties from invasion or negotiating a compromise peace that left Japan's militarist government partially intact. The cost of developing this capability, $3.7 billion, represented 1% of America's total war expenditure of $296 billion. This investment produced an aircraft that fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific, enabled the atomic missions that ended the war, and demonstrated American industrial supremacy, so completely that potential adversaries adjusted their strategic calculations accordingly. Soviet leaders, witnessing B-29 capabilities, accelerated their own strategic bomber programs and nuclear weapons development, initiating the Cold War arms race. The B-29's existence made nuclear deterrence possible by providing a delivery system for atomic weapons, creating the strategic framework that would define international relations for the next half-century. In historical perspective, the B-29 Superfortress occupies a unique position as the aircraft that bridged conventional and nuclear warfare. It was the last piston-engine strategic bomber and the first nuclear bomber. It represented the apex of propeller-driven aircraft technology and the beginning of the atomic age. It was both the culmination of strategic bombing theory developed over 2 decades and the instrument that proved that theory while forcing its evolution. These contradictions reflect the transitional nature of the period in which it operated, a brief window between the industrial warfare of 1939 to 1945 and the nuclear standoff that followed. The story of the B-29 is ultimately a story of American industrial power applied with ruthless efficiency to military problems. German and Japanese engineers laughed at early intelligence reports showing an aircraft that violated their principles of efficient design. They stopped laughing when 3,970 of these inefficient bombers systematically destroyed the industrial capacity and urban centers that sustained enemy war efforts. The laughter turned to bitter acknowledgement that American engineering, operating under different constraints and pursuing different objectives than Axis aviation, had produced a weapon system that rendered their own approaches obsolete. The B-29 didn't defeat Germany directly, as it never operated in Europe, but its existence and capabilities influenced German strategic calculations and demonstrated the futility of attempting industrial competition with American production capacity. Against Japan, it was decisive, delivering both the conventional destruction that crippled Japanese war-making ability and the atomic weapons that provided the final strategic shock, forcing surrender. What do you think of the B-29 Superfortress? Was it a necessary instrument of strategic victory that shortened the war and saved lives by making invasion unnecessary? Or was it a symbol of industrial warfare's capacity for unprecedented destruction of civilian populations? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.